Good evening and welcome everyone to this edition of the Philosophical Cafe, in which we are going to make appeal to your imagination even more than usual. Because we are going to invite you to join us in a trip that goes beyond our regular subjects of discussion, beyond books, beyond texts and philosophical arguments, into the world of the chemical laboratory. And actually not only of the chemical laboratory, let's just call it laboratory, perhaps with a big L. Our guests tonight are historians, but they do history with very different tools. They take ancient texts with them in the laboratory, trying to reconstruct and replicate old experiments, old recipes. And this is called, they say, experimental history. At least this is a very rough definition of the subject, and we are going to discuss more about it tonight and give lots and lots of examples because we have many speakers, many guests. And together with Georgiana Hedesan, we will try to moderate the discussion, or maybe mediate the discussion so that it reaches our two audiences, one which is with us on Zoom, welcome everyone, and one which is with us on the YouTube, welcome to you too. Everyone can ask questions and intervene in the discussion. Those who are on Zoom can do that directly. Please let us know when you want to speak. Those who are on YouTube, you can write your questions. I'm going to introduce them into the discussion. So, Joe, you were the initiator of tonight's session. You are working yourself in experimental history, and you are largely responsible for selecting our guests. So I will let you introduce them and ask the first question of our discussion. And you have to turn on your microphone.
Yes, thank you, Donna. I will start by saying experimental history is an exciting new field of research, and it attempts to recreate historical experiments and recipes. And there are actually many names for what this does. Some people call it reconstruction, some people call it recreation, reworking, replication, reenactment, reproduction. It goes on like this. Surprisingly, then, all these are usually discussed as being the RRR framework. What they do have in common is the attempt to understand the past by embodied activities, by embodied experience, like doing and making. So I'm Jo Hedesan from University of Oxford, and together with Donna, we will be moderating a discussion with not less than 8 specialists in the field who will share with us their experience in carrying out reconstructions. This is an opportunity for us actually to carry out our own experiments, since we've never had so many speakers at the Philosophical Cafe before. And it was actually very difficult to select and keep the numbers down because there are so many exciting researchers and exciting research being done in this field. So I will kick off the discussion by asking the general question: why did you start doing recreations of experiments, and how did these complement your research? So I will be briefly introducing each of the speakers and ask them to answer this question in turn, while asking them to limit their response to about 3 minutes. So first up is William Newman, professor at Indiana University. Bill?
Hi, Joe. Thanks for inviting me. So I've been working in the area of replicating alchemical experiments for about 20 years. I started out doing what I call demonstration experiments, which are fairly well-known and easy to replicate experiments that I then filmed and put up online on the Chemistry of Isaac Newton's site. And the purpose of this was to allow people who weren't able to go into laboratories to see what Newton was talking about in the 30 or 40 years that he carried out alchemical experimentation. He describes a lot of this in his laboratory notebooks, and in some instances, like I said, it's pretty easy to figure out, but not always. And this, the presentation of difficulties in the notebooks led me into a different type of historical replication, which is really a case of experiments of discovery. Let me give you an example if I have time. Newton talks about something he calls spirit of antimony, or vinegar of antimony, or liquor of antimony, or salt of antimony. I was able to show using latent semantic analysis on the text that these are all the same thing, but I still didn't know what that thing was. And that's a problem because other people like Basil Valentine, whose work Newton knew, use these same terms, but not necessarily to mean the same thing as Newton. So replicating this liquor of antimony or spirit of antimony allowed me to figure out the goal, really, of Newton's alchemical experimentation. What he does is he takes this product and he dissolves metals in it, crystallizes them, uses the so-called vitriol in conjunction with sal ammoniac and other antimony compounds to sublime materials, and the goal is to get more and more volatile double salts of metals. So this would have been impossible to figure out unless I actually replicated the experiments. And I bet my 3 minutes are up.
Well, thank you, Bill. Next up is Sven Dupré, professor at the University of Utrecht and the director of the Art Techne project. Sven?
Hi, good evening. Yes, I'm the director of the Art Techne project. And so in the Art Techne project, we've engaged with reworking as a method of historical inquiry, I think in many different ways. And some of the people involved in that are here also tonight. I'll focus on just one of the most recent, reenactments or recreations that we've done together with Marika Hendrickson and Thijs Hagendijk. It's about the recreation of a Rosichiero glass on the basis of a set of 17th century texts on glassmaking. So it's a transparent red glass. It's published as an article also recently in Ambix. I think in the Art Techne project more generally, we've been sort of designing repractices primarily with an interest towards skill, toward processes of learning in the arts, so not just alchemy. And we're both interested there in what skill is, how it is acquired, as well as in the role of different sorts of texts in and the role they actually play in historical processes of learning in the arts. So what do artisans do with text is one of the sort of central questions that we've been asking. And for that, we've also looked, I think quite importantly, in designing our repractices and re-research, looked also into other disciplines. Because, tonight here, I think most of us have a background in history of science. This as a sort of method is quite, or might be relatively new in the history of science, experimental history of science. And it's typically, I think, in that discipline positioned vis-a-vis with replication in the natural sciences. But reconstruction, replication, reenactment, reconstruction, however you want to call it, they have much longer histories in numerous disciplines in the humanities, including conservation, archaeology, and musicology. And one of the things that we've been doing is actually bringing those different sort of histories together in sort of one general genealogy of this, which also allows us to sort of cross-fertilize across these different disciplines, cross-fertilize into sort of what might be interesting in designing reconstruction practices. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is the discipline of archaeology. I mean, it's interesting that we started out by saying this is about the laboratory. One of the things that we've been advocating is moving outside the laboratory to reconstruct some of these practices in open air spaces where you have a different range of materials, other technologies, less control upon the environment, and which you might indeed in ways also be closer to the material conditions under which processes of making in the early modern period in which we were interested actually took place. So we do something there that's quite not unusual for experimental archaeologists to do, but which might be new or different for historians of science. Now, to come back to the example with which I was going to talk about, so the Rosiquero, the red glass, we moved in that case to, different spaces outside the lab, including the Villa Borg, which is a reconstructed Roman villa, which is basically turned into sort of experimental archaeology site during the glass furnace experiment, which is happening there like every year, in which glassmakers from pretty much all over Europe flock to that particular place. We've been particularly attracted to such places because they would give us access to wood-fired furnaces. And doing that really changed my understanding of Kunkel's annotated commentary of Antonius Neris' book on the art of glassmaking. And we had previously identified Kunkel's, what I thought was a pretty innovative strategy of writing down his knowledge as codification of error. But by reworking these recipes for Rosiquero glass outside the laboratory, made clear that not only for Kunkel, these corrections were not always sort of improvements, but that fire and furnace management really became key elements in the making of Rosiquero glass, and that were exactly also those aspects which Kunkel, in his comments on Neris' recipes, pointed out as needing particular attention. And this is something that would not have come to our attention or to my attention without actually moving outside the laboratory and trying to reconstruct some of these recipes in wood-fired furnaces. And I think my 3 minutes are also up in this way.
Thank you, Sven. Next up is Jenny Rampling, Associate Professor at Princeton University. Jenny?
Thank you very much. So I first came across experimental replication during my PhD on the alchemy of George Ripley, a 15th century canon based in northeast England. And at the time, I was trying to work out what exactly Ripley was talking about in his densely encoded and often allegorical text. So I was already familiar with the work of scholars like William Newman, who's here today, and Lawrence Principe in trying to reconstruct experiments. Although the experiments that had been the focus of their work seemed to be for a slightly later period, mostly 17th century. So the question I had was, is it possible to apply the same sort of techniques to reconstructing medieval recipes as it is for the later ones? Now, the problem here is that you're trying to extrapolate practices out of highly encoded texts. So to give just one example, a 14th century treatise might talk about blood, but it's only using blood as a cover name for some kind of mineral substance. Alternatively, you might have the opposite. You might have a text that talks about what seems to be a mineral substance, but they actually mean blood. So how do we know which one they were talking about? Well, one way of testing that meaning is by trying the experiment ourselves. And I suppose my real insight was realizing that the alchemists themselves had this problem. So George Ripley in the 15th century is also trying to read his own 14th century authorities and trying to extract workable processes out of them. Now, what are the implications for the history of our field? Well, it means that early modern readers are constantly trying to interpret their sources. And it means that if we want to follow them in what they're doing, we can't just look at how they were practicing, but also how they read. What happens if their interpretation differs from the one that was intended by their author? Well, presumably the underlying chemistry will change. But what's so interesting about that is they might not realize that the chemistry's changed. They might actually think that they are reenacting the process as originally conceived of by the authority. So in my PhD dissertation, and then again in my recent book, I refer to this as a feedback loop, as a cyclical process called practical exegesis, where you read the text, you try to work out what you think it means, and then you go to the lab or the workroom, and then you run that yourself and you see if it works. And if it doesn't work, you go back to the text and see if you've read it wrongly and try to reinterpret it. And then when you write your own treatise, as these alchemists often did, you incorporate your findings into the new treatise, which means that the way you write about alchemy technically changes over time as well. But often on a superficial read, it looks as though the processes being described are actually the same. So as a historian of alchemy, I've been very interested in trying to trace that relationship between text and practice and trying to reconstruct the experiment myself serves as a kind of additional philological aid. It's a way of testing whether I too am reading the text correctly, even while accepting at the same time that the correct reading might be beyond our grasp. I might think I've got it right, but in actual fact, I'm doing exactly what my early modern actors were, which is to say, subtly innovating in the chemistry, even while thinking that I'm cleaving to the authority that I'm studying. I think that's my time, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Next up is Marika Hendrickson, a researcher at the Humanities Cluster of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Marieke, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here and to see you all. Right, so the first time I actually did something that resembled a reconstruction was during my PhD. I was studying the 18th century Leiden anatomical collections, which consist mostly of wet preparations of human body parts. And I was trying to write a material history of these preparations. And that turned out to be nearly impossible doing that just based on written sources and visual analysis, because there was very little there, basically. And what I found indicated that the people who made these preparations were extraordinarily proud of them. And saw them as, well, some of them saw them as their greatest accomplishment as anatomists. And that made me wonder exactly how they were made, and I couldn't find any documentation on that. And I asked the curators of the collection, and they said, well, it must be very difficult, but I found that such an unsatisfactory answer that in the end, I decided that I wanted to try and reconstruct those preparations without actually pretending that I could ever create something similar or replicate that, but it did really help me. And of course, I didn't use human material. I used, for example, sheep hearts, but it really did give me more insight in how these preparations were created and how much effort it would have taken to learn how to do that. And also, it gave both me and the curator of the collection more insight in the actual materials that were used, because a lot of that up till then was based on guesswork. And by trying to recreate such preparations, we actually figured out which materials were most likely used. So that was very useful in terms of conservation as well. And after that, I've regularly included reconstruction practices in my research. Most recently, I recreated a little chemical oven as it was used by Herman Boerhaave together with Ruben Verwaal. And we also published a paper on that in a special issue of Berichte zur Wissenschaftsgeschichte, which appeared last year, about rethinking performative methods in the history of science. And some of the other speakers here and some of the other guests also contributed to that, including Pamela's group and Donna Bilac. And I think that's nearly 3 minutes, so I'll give the floor back to someone else. Thank you. You're still muted, Joe.
Joe, your microphone is muted.
Okay. So next up is Donna Bilac. She's an independent scholar who is also teaching at the New York University, and she's a creative director of the 12 Keys Consultancy and Design. Donna?
Hi, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's so lovely to see old faces and new. Thank you for the invitation, Joe and Donna. So I'm coming at this maybe from a different angle. First, I did contribute to Marike's excellent special edition. And thank you for that opportunity, Marike, to share imitation, choral, and cross-cultural contexts from Pamela's Making and Knowing project. I had taken the imitation choral recipe that we reconstructed at Columbia in 2014, and I experimented with its reconstruction both in in the Canadian Arctic with Inuit Metal Arts students at Nunavut Arctic College, and also with Dominic Huneger's group, most recently in 2020, February, just before the world shut down, with his group at the Universität Hamburg. And that, excuse me, budgies, they get excited when I talk about coral. That was an interesting experiment for taking the same recipe and having it reconstructed in three very different educational contexts. Because we worked from the same text, essentially with the same ingredients, but yet we produced three completely individualized different artifacts. What I want to pivot and talk about today is where reconstruction has led me. And it's actually led me to a concept that I'm referring to as retro technology transfer. And if you're familiar with the term technology transfer, this refers to the transfer of new technology from the originator to a secondary user. Retro technology transfer, therefore, thinks about ways to bring historical technology and practice to our present modern time in order to respond to contemporary socio-environmental issues. So with retro technology transfer, this aims to create a field of possibilities around practices, technologies, and aesthetics for people to make things and to make a difference in our world. And this is where 12 Keys consultancy and design comes into play, because so rude. Sorry. Before I became a historian, I was trained as a goldsmith. I actually hold a professional diploma in metal arts from a vocational school in Toronto, Canada. So through Pamela's Making and Knowing project, on which I was a postdoc from 2014 to 2017, my inner goldsmith got reawakened. And with 12 Keys Consultancy and Design, I'm exploring minerals and metals from an alchemical context in terms of addressing environmental and humanitarian issues that gold and mercury amalgamation mining has created for our current society. In fact, our biosphere is being poisoned by this practice. The jewelry line that I'm producing is tightly connected to a research project that I have on the go, which is slated for publication in Ambix as a special issue in 2023. And it explores gold and mercury and the ways in which these two interrelated metals have worked their way through bodies, cultures, and environments. So from a transcultural and transhistorical perspective. So what reconstruction has actually done for me is it's taken me to extend my practice as a historian and alloy it with who I am as a maker. And alchemy becomes a framework for me to engage as, I guess what I'll say, a socially relevant historian in how I, as a scholar and a maker, have identified environmental and social issues that I can address by being an academic through designing the types of projects like the Gold and Mercury project, and also through the jewelry line, where I can connect audiences to what we do as scholars in the field of early modern alchemy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Donna. I actually jumped over Dagmar Wujastyk, and I'm sorry. This goes to show how tricky it is to have 8 invitees, but Dagmar is an associate professor at University of Alberta, and she is running an ERC starting grant on the intersection between Ayurveda and yoga and Indian alchemy. But she probably can tell you more than me. Dagmar, can you?
Sure.
Please.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so I work on the history of the Indian alchemical tradition, which is called Rasa Shastra. And we have texts from this tradition from the 10th century forward up to the present, really, texts written in Sanskrit. And most of these texts have not yet been translated into any non-Indic language, so also not into English. And that's part of what I am doing, just to sort of make these texts available to a wider audience as historical sources. And really as a representation, as part of Indic culture of its time. So translating one of the oldest texts, or actually the oldest text of this tradition, I was very struck by the evocative language used to describe processes, procedures for making mercurial elixirs. So the kind of language used, for about mercury would be that mercury would be made to sweat. It would be stunned. You would bind it. You would wake it up, and you would kill it. And I was just, in reading this, clearly this was technical vocabulary that had a specific meaning to the alchemists. But I also just wondered whether there was a correspondence to the actual physical state of the mercury going through these procedures that would sort of explain this kind of language. So I thought, as part of my project, we had some space to develop some creative ways of approaching our topics. So I thought we could just do some recreations. And there, it's important to know that the Indian alchemical tradition is in part a living tradition. So parts of it, the pharmacological and medical aspects survive to the present. It's today a sort of subdivision of classical Indian medicine, which is a sort of state-regulated kind of medicine. So there are people today who are using particular procedures first developed in, probably the 10th century. So I found a collaborator, someone trained in this modern pharmacological tradition of Rasa Shastra, someone in the UK, Andrew Mason, who agreed to try and recreate some of these recipes that are not part of the modern tradition anymore, just to see whether we could see, all these words, these terms used for the conditions of mercury, whether this, would be very visible in recreating these procedures. So we did just that, starting with, I did the translations, and then Andrew would try to recreate from there, and always also, though consulting with more modern Rasa Shastra works and other Rasa Shastra practitioners from India. And so, the initial idea was just to get a deeper understanding of the text, but of course also to just get a deeper understanding about what the alchemists were actually doing. Indian alchemy is not a very well-known field, not even within South Asian studies. Very few people have read them. Of course, modern practitioners use the text, not the very oldest ones, but some of the later ones. But this is an area of Indic thought that really is sort of underrepresented. So in doing these experiments, I just wanted to, obviously, deepen my understanding, but also bring it into a format that would perhaps be more immediately attractive to other people, sort of engaging with it. So we made a series of films of our experimental reconstructions, and I wrote some blogs with that. We've had some publications. All of this is on the project website, iyoyog.org. Maybe we can put it into the chat to see if you want to have a look at what we did. So it's really just it was two things, first of all, to sort of deepen my understanding of what the text was trying to say, what alchemists were doing, what they were thinking, what was their understanding of materials. And then also at the same time to sort of let other people join in by viewing these experiments. So I think that might cover my 3 minutes.
Thank you, Dagmar. Next up is Joaquin Perez-Pariente, a research professor at the Institute of Catalysis of the Spanish Research Council. And I'm really sorry if I don't pronounce your names correctly. I'm doing my best, but but thank you. Please go ahead, Joaquin.
It's fine like that. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And I am working on the replication of an 18th century French recipe for the preparation of potable gold. So I selected this specific topic to work on potable gold because it was said at that time that this preparation could contain gold in the form of very small particles. And I am a chemist, not an historian, and I'm working in catalysis, and maybe these teeny small particles of gold could be used for catalysis. So then, for the reason I selected one specific recipe for potable gold is the potable gold of Mademoiselle Grimaldi. Okay, this was a remedy. It was very famous at that time. It was sold at the pharmacies of Paris in the second half of the 18th century. And also I selected this specifically because it was a very clear, it is in fact a very clearly described recipe. So there was no gap, I would say, very little space for guessing. Yeah? This was important to me. So the recipe is very well described, it's very simple. You have to dissolve gold in aqua regia, and then you have to add rosemary essential oil, and the oil remains on top of the aqua regia. After a few days, you take it and dissolve the rosemary oil with ethanol. You obtain a product, and this is the potable gold. Okay, so this product indeed contains gold, and the most important thing is that it contains gold in the form of very small particles, nanoparticles with a size of very few nanometers. But also, and this is even more interesting, it contains clusters of gold and even isolated atoms of gold. So when we realized that, we reworked the recipe in order to optimize, to increase the amount of cluster of gold, which is the most interesting part of the gold. And then we use this gold preparation to make catalyst and to use actual catalyst. Okay, so now we are using this in order to prepare catalysts, which are very active, able to catalyze different kind of reactions. And this is, I like this because it's an example on how to recover the past historical chemical knowledge to do something in the present. It's not only in my opinion, it's not important only to recreate the past experiment in order to understand the history of chemistry, which we are also we do that also, but also I think it is interesting maybe to explore some of these old recipes in order to determine whether they can have something interesting for current chemistry and even for modern society. We can discuss this later on. So thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you, Joaquin. Last but not least, Thijs Hagendijk. Probably not the right pronunciation, but Thijs is a lecturer at the University of Utrecht. Thijs?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, I really started doing reconstructions in the team, which was, of course, already introduced earlier by Sven Dupré. So let me give another example. Really, the first reenactment that I performed was to better understand this little book. It is a guidebook for young and upcoming gold and silversmiths written at the beginning of the 18th century. And to me, this was a very interesting case because I wanted to know, given its statement that it served the young gold and silversmiths, I wanted to know how this book could be used in the education, in apprenticeship learning, and the education of these young people, these students. And this is an interesting question because practical knowledge, it has quite some tacit dimensions, of course. If you want to learn how to do things with your hands, if you want to learn how to perform certain skills, it can be very hard to put this into words. And here specifically, I became interested in reenacting the things that are being described in this book as a way to understand how the text, how the author tries to find methods to put this very hard to describe knowledge into words. I worked together on this, together with a practicing silversmith, so someone who really knows his stuff, and who was in the position actually to teach me the things that are also explained in this book. So Now, by reenacting and being introduced to the art of gold and silversmithing in practice, I had experience, some experience at least, to compare what the author was doing in the book and what I had been learning on the shop floor. And the interesting thing is that soon I realized that reenacting in this way is really a very good method to create it, or to understand and analyze the typology of tested knowledge. I mean, tested knowledge is not just one category, and you can look into it, you can delve into it, and as soon as you do that, you can see that there's also different kinds of types of knowledge that all similar to each other, but also in very different ways are very hard to express. One of the examples is that we encountered was the knowledge needed to assemble a mold for casting. You need a casting flask, you need sand, you need to make an impression in the mold, and then you need to cast it with silver. And all this information was really described in the book, but not the way in which you had to assemble all the pieces, in what order you had to do this. And of course, this is crucial knowledge in order to cast right. Another thing is that we saw that sensory indicators were lacking. If you work with materials, you need to read these materials, to understand these materials, to understand the behavior. You have to watch for certain cues, of course, which would tell you when to act, when to do certain things, and when to go to the next step. And especially this kind of knowledge was lacking. So, well, in the end, we draw the conclusion that this is still a very valuable book, but it needed complementary hands-on instruction. But the lesson that I really learned is that reenacting is a very good way to unpack tested knowledge, to unpack these silent dimensions that are waiting in the text to be discovered. Thank you.
Joe, you're muted.
Well, I was waiting.
We are done. It's my turn. Okay, it is my turn. If it is my turn, I was kind of trying to listen carefully to our guests and imagine how would I introduce you to a general public? You are historians, but you're also a bit detectives, some of you at least, and I'm sure that Bill Newman is going to tell us a bit about being a detective in relation with Newton's alchemical manuscripts. And, some of you are alchemists or artisans, but also a bit philosophers, at least when it comes to questions of whether replication is at all possible, or what exactly is that you are doing. Some of you are saying that you are replicating experiments. Some of you are saying that you are enacting experiments. Some of you are saying that you are reconstructing experiments. And last but not least, there is a bit of question about, there is an interesting question about what is still interesting for the science today to reenact or reconstruct or retrieve some of the lost knowledge that you can find in these experiments. So I was wondering, okay, what does it take to recreate or replicate or reconstruct an experiment? Clearly, from what you have said already, it takes a sort of good knowledge or perhaps a deeper knowledge of the texts than traditional historians have. Perhaps a different way of reading, perhaps a special insight into materials, but also some sort of reconstructing situations, a sort of imaginative role play that was coming again and again in your presentations, either as a pedagogical tool or as a heuristic tool. So I would start with the detective part, and I would invite Bill Newman to say something about Newton. I didn't realize there is a kind of interesting similarity of names here so far. Are you playing Newton in the laboratory, Bill?
Am I playing Newton in the laboratory? That's a difficult question. I'm certainly not consciously doing that. For one thing, Newton was infinitely smarter than I am, so that would that would be difficult to do. But yeah, no, I'm certainly trying to track down specific things in Newton's notebooks and also in his notes more generally. I mean, one of the big mysteries with Newton is how you go from his reading notes to his laboratory notebooks. And one thing that provides a key is the reappearance of decknamen, cover names, that he's getting out of reading alchemical texts in the laboratory notebooks themselves. So that, for example, he takes the interpretation of George Starkey or Irenaeus Philalethes of Ovid's description of the myth of Cadmus, you know, who killed a dragon and founded Thebes. And in Starkey's interpretation, the dragon becomes stibnite, the ore of antimony, which is used to refine metals. And Newton reinterprets the entire Philalethian interpretation so that there's this kind of meta-analysis going on. But one of the things that I'm getting at is that you can't just rely on the sense of the original text that Newton is interpreting, because he builds really an entirely different process on that text. And really, the only way to figure out exactly what he's doing is to go to the laboratory and try to replicate the experiment. So that is a kind of sleuth work, certainly, or detective work, if you like.
Yeah, actually, maybe Virgilio Tache has an interesting question now, exactly on this point. Virgil being an ecologist and a scientist at the University of Bucharest. Virgil, do you want to ask a question yourself, or shall I read it?
I think that your English is better than mine, so please.
Oh, and your English is perfect. Okay, anyway, Virgil is asking, Bill, or perhaps all of you, are you reconstructing the know-how, or do you fully understand the meaning of the know-what of the written descriptions of the experiments?
Well, yeah, that leads to an interesting point, which is that in order to understand what Newton is doing, which is really kind of sui generis, what he's doing is rather idiosyncratic, relying so heavily on sublimation. At any rate, you have to basically get a pretty decent mastery of what was called vulgar chemistry in the 17th century, which was the kind of chemistry that was taught in textbooks that go back to the beginning of the 17th century and have a very wide dispersion in the period. So there's a whole panoply of techniques and materials and apparatus that are discussed in these textbooks. And in order to even begin to replicate Newton's processes, you have to have that kind of background. You have to teach yourself how to be a 17th century chemist before you can really figure out what Newton is doing that is, in fact, partly based on that and partly new.
Jenny, I think you would like to intervene on this question as well.
Thank you very much. I think it's an important question, actually, because there are different kinds of reconstruction. There are different kinds of knowledge that we seek to retrieve when we try and reconstruct a process. One is, I suppose, the original sense of the process. So when George Ripley says, the body calcined into red, which by masters is called saracon, what actual substance is he talking about here? Does he mean red lead? Does he mean copper? Does he mean antimony? And if you don't get that right, you can't really start the process in a way that's going to be sort of authentic to the historical Ripley's process. On the other hand, there's all kinds of tacit knowledge that you can recover. So even if I were following a recipe which I believed could be read absolutely literally, take half a pound of this, take half a pound of that, I would still learn a lot about the process of doing that kind of chemistry. So the know-how, if you like, simply by reconstructing it. I've learned a lot of both from my reconstructions, but I think what the question's really getting at is perhaps where the starting point is. So usually, because I tend to use reconstruction as a philological tool, I'm usually trying to actually understand what the author means, what the author's saying. So I want to know what Ripley's Sericon is, for example, and how his readers also interpreted it by seeing if the chemistry works. So in that case, I might start with, and actually I'm really happy that Hasok Chang is here today because he provided a neat categorization of different kinds of experimental replications in an article on reconstructing historical experiments in a pedagogical setting, where he distinguished between physical reconstructions, where you just try to sort of recreate the basic effects, and historical reconstructions, where you try to make everything as authentic as possible. So early modern glassware with all of its imperfections, rather than modern Pyrex, not using a Liebig condenser, and so on. And he also suggested that there's this thing called extension, which is what happens when you actually extend the original recipe and basically start experimenting on your own account. So the kind of processes I've been reconstructing have been more physical effects, in that I just want to use them as a test to see if I'm reading the chemistry roughly right. And I completely agree with what Bill Newman just said, which is it really helps to have a good background of vulgar chemistry at the period. So if you go into trying to reconstruct a George Ripley recipe and you don't already know that everybody in the second half of the 15th century in England seems to be obsessed with this thing called the neutral body or the imperfect body and how you can distill it in a wine-based solvent, then Ripley's not going to make a whole lot of sense. On the other hand, if you're familiar with that tradition and you know that people are basically making acetates, as we now call them, out of base metals, then you've immediately got a sort of context which you can use as your platform for then trying to reconstruct a physical experiment.
At this point, I was wondering what your views are on how accurate these experiments can be. I think there is a debate on whether these things can be called replication or they can be called accurately using the same substances, the same body movements, the same, let's say, the same processes that they used to use in the past. I'm just wondering for, first Bill and Jenny and maybe the others as well to intervene on this subject. Basically, how far can you go with the replicating an historical experiment?
This question of whether to do, full historical reenactment as opposed to just trying to produce a physical effect, it's going to depend on the particular type of experiment that you're trying to do, right? Let me give you an example. If you were trying to replicate...
Nabila, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but can you explain what does full historical reenactment mean? Getting the materials, the right materials that are historical as well or something? What?
If you wanted to, let me give you an example. Here in the United States, there are various historical sites like Plymouth Plantation, where there are essentially actors reenacting the 17th century life of the settlers at Plymouth. And, they dress up in period clothing. They try to answer questions as though they were the actual people from the 17th century. And of course, all the apparatus, blacksmithery equipment and so forth is period, right? So if you wanted to do something along those lines, maybe not with the funny clothes, but anyway, something along those lines, with, say, Lavoisier, in the 18th century, where he disproves Boyle's transmutation of water into earth, well, you have to use the type of glass that Lavoisier was using, because what he does is he heats up water for an extended period of time in what's called a pelican, and it decomposes the glass to produce a powder that Boyle misinterpreted as earth that had been transmuted out of the water. So in that kind of instance, you certainly have to use period equipment. But if you're just trying to do something like sublime sal ammoniac, which isn't really going to attack the glass significantly, for that particular experiment, you don't need 18th century glass. So the whole thing depends on what it is exactly that you're trying to do.
So I agree with that, and I'd add to it that sometimes the errors and the misunderstandings that we're guilty of as we try to reconstruct processes can actually teach us something about the past as well, especially if we assume that early modern readers also struggled in the same way we struggled, and perhaps even made the same mistakes. So the example that jumps to my mind is when with Peter Wothers at the chemistry department at Cambridge, I was trying to create this effect called the gliding fire, where you basically have very finely divided lead, which would ignite if you put a hot coal on it, and you get this beautiful golden effect sort of swooping across the surface of the lead, which is really pretty. And it's mentioned in repeated early modern alchemical sources, so clearly other people also thought it was interesting. What's interesting is, sort of going to Bill's point, is we were just using, we got this from basic litharge, just ordered from a modern chemical catalogue, so it probably had none of the impurities that early modern lead would have had. And there's a very good chance it's not exactly the same kind of substance that George Ripley was talking about in his process. But at this point, we were just trying to get the basic effect. And you actually can get the basic effect of the color change from the lead. But here's the thing, it came out of the flask so pyrophoric, or so sort of inclined to ignite, that a couple of times it just ignited, and you got the golden effect before you put the coal anywhere near it. And we were quite excited about this. We thought this was really interesting, and then discovered it in a late 16th century text. It was another writer who describes exactly the same thing. He says, if you don't let it cool down enough, it'll take fire by itself, like a cannon's fuse. So sometimes, you make a mistake or you misunderstand, and then you discover someone else has made the same misunderstanding, which immediately sort of takes you into that late 16th century laboratory of somebody else who's also pushing different aspects of the text. So I think, I'm never going to stand up and say that I have exactly reconstructed an alchemical process. I just don't have the knowledge to be sure of that. And also, I suppose, a completely successful reconstruction would mean that I had made gold at the end of it. And I have not made gold at the end of it, unless you count research money for ongoing work. But I do, my own belief is that transmutation won't work, but that you can actually follow the chemistry up to a point because it's based on real experiments that people were actually doing. And the fascinating point is, can we actually identify that moment, that kind of abyss between what is replicable and what is no longer replicable? And are we positioning the abyss at the same time as our early modern actors did in their practice?
I will also invite Marieke to contribute, since she recently published an article, actually a special issue on the subject, and she had some interesting comments about replication. Marieke?
Yes, thank you, Jo. No, I fully agree with Bill and Jenny, actually, that what you can replicate or reenact really also, it really depends on the question you're trying to answer, how important it is, exactly how far you want to go. And also, I think there's the whole idea of historical accuracy might be a fallacy in the sense that we can never attain 100% historical accuracy, right? So we are always trying to approach the historical situation, historical processes, but how far we go in that really depends on the kind of questions we're trying to answer. And as Jenny also mentioned, sometimes you also learn things about the past that you weren't actually really looking for. For example, when Ruben and I were working with the Boerhaven oven, which we wanted to reconstruct to begin with, because there is no historical example of that. We just had drawings and sources that mentioned that kind of chemical oven being used, but there actually is no 18th century example of such a chemical oven in any collection, or there's not been anything found archaeologically, because these things were made of wood, so they just basically disappeared. So what we were primarily interested in was, do these things actually work if you build them? That was the first question. And could you actually use them together with Boerhaven's hugely popular handbook on chemistry to perform experiments and learn chemistry, sort of self-taught course almost. And what we hadn't expected, but which in the end turned out to be really important, was the fuel for the oven, because it had to be peat. And that's something that was really common in the 18th century Low Countries, but now can't be found here anymore. It's been depleted, basically. And then, so you can get peat from Ireland and from Germany, but is it the same kind of peat? And so we went to the peat museum, there's still a peat museum in the Netherlands, to figure out if we were actually using the right kind of peat and whether that actually would make a difference to the experiments. And the answer was a resounding yes. So it turned out that something we hadn't even thought about to begin with, namely the fuel, was hugely important. So in that sense, I think that these kinds of research projects also give you insights in the past that you weren't really looking for.
We have a lot of questions, and we have questions here on the chat, we have questions on the YouTube. So perhaps one question, because Bill and Jenny are going to be forced to leave soon. So let's take Monica Solomon's question first of all. Monica.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is really, I find all this very interesting, and like a historian of science, it's really, really, that I want to hear more about it. But I was thinking about, say, the part of the audience of this discussion, which might not have so much interest in like 16th century experiments, right? Let's just grant them that, or 17th century or whatever. And they might have this idea that science proceeds somehow from first principles, that, like scientists, what they're doing, they're trying to find regularities and causal laws or something like that. And what I find fascinating in all these descriptions is the sheer complexity of what's going on a practical level. So could you just say something to these people who are so hooked on laws of nature, on, experiments with clear outcomes that confirm or disconfirm our hypotheses, and just explain and tell them, why this richness of what's going on there is so very important, right? And not just for historical reasons, as in, X did this in 1600s or something. It's just like nowadays, just like the world is just as complicated. And yeah, I just would like you to comment on that from your own experience, maybe to just speak to that kind of thought. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monica. This sounds a lot like the modern problem of reductionism. What happens if we try to reduce all of chemistry just to the laws of physics? And the answer is you lose all of the, the smells, the special properties of materials, and you also introduce new problems, which is it's actually really difficult to extrapolate from atomic structure to what the physical and chemical properties of a substance will be when we're working with it in the real world. And I think, another danger of that kind of reductionism is that, our world is actually shaped by environmental factors. So, the messiness in which we live doesn't go away. Even when we have what we think is a very clear-cut experiment, sometimes, the background, temperature fluctuations or any one of 1,000 different kinds of sort of unexpected eventualities can affect your results. And you can try to clean up your lab system as much as you want, but that messiness is sort of intrinsic to our human experience and to the nature of matter itself. So I think, the first thing I'd want to just say to our imaginary interlocutor is the scientific method is itself something that has a history. It wasn't just kind of, magically born, at 1st of January 1500s and developed from there. It's something that has its own history, and that's going to be a messy history with steps back as well as steps forward. So it's a nice ideal to have in mind, but if we actually go back and look at the richness of materials and the way that they behave, it tells us an awful lot about why things were the way they were in the past. So for example, instead of mocking early modern physicians for using remedies that we don't think sound very credible today, or mocking alchemists for believing in structures of matter that we no longer adhere to, we might want to ask the far more interesting questions of why did they believe these things worked? And that often takes you into the properties of the materials. And the fact is, take antimony, for example, Bill's example earlier, antimony is an extraordinary mineral. It takes many different forms, both in nature and in the laboratory, depending on what you do to it, ranging from a reddish ore to a glass-like structure that's actually called the glass of antimony. It can be used to purge metals, so you can use it to clean up gold and purify gold, but you can also use it as an emetic, a pretty violent emetic as well. So it looks as though it has metallurgical and medicinal uses, and these are actual measurable effects. So I think we need to engage with these properties of material and understand them in order to get a good sense of the past, which as historians should surely be our goal. Thanks.
We have a very interesting question coming from YouTube, actually. Wana Chiteshte asked whether you are actually peer reviewing past science. And Bill, what is your point of view in this?
Yes, well, the basic assumption behind that is that I'm a peer, isn't it? So I'm not sure that's really accurate. Peer reviewing past science. Well, insofar as we're trying to replicate old experiments, I suppose, there is something to that. Of course, like Jenny said, you can't replicate these old experiments 100%. I mean, it's difficult to replicate even modern experiments 100%. So what you try to do is to find descriptions of the products in the material that you're looking at. And by the way, one thing that we found is that where you are lucky enough to have laboratory notebooks written by an alchemist, they tend to be extremely revealing, because typically, though not always, they avoid the sort of menagerie of cover names and elaborate riddles that you find in the written texts. Just working from the written texts is actually typically quite a bit harder than working from the laboratory notebooks. So peer reviewing, well, occasionally you do find pretty clear descriptions of alchemical products, especially in notebooks. And those are what you use more often than not to determine whether you've got it right. So even if we can't get it 100% right, maybe we can get it 75% right. And that's a heck of a lot better than 0%.
Maybe the same question can go to Joaquin, for example. Are you peer reviewing the alchemical recipes that you are looking at?
Yeah, okay, yes. I agree. I fully agree with William, what he said, because this is also the strategy that I have applied. I have been looking for description in the documents in order to check whether the properties of the product they described there were the same as the properties that I was determining in the product that I obtained. For instance, at the beginning, I was thinking that I was wrong, because in the recipe I mentioned before that in this case rosemary oil was used. Okay, so all the recipe said that the rosemary oil get a yellow color, but this never happened to us, never. So we have repeated this experiment many, I mean 20, 30 times, many times, and it never happens. So then by checking and looking more carefully to the text, one of the commentators to the recipe recognized that some kind of oily substance was formed due to the reaction between the aqua regia and the rosemary oil. Okay, so this gives us an idea that something happened, but it is true that the recipe itself said something that we never observed. So I wonder whether this recipe was taken by someone who never checked it, who never did it. Okay. Also, we look for in another different kind of test to determine if the people replicated the recipe at that time, okay, and what they observed. And for instance, people said that after a while, after a few days, or even a few weeks, some gold precipitate on the vessel, on the recipient. Okay, and we have observed that, for instance. Or for instance, William Lewis, the British chemist, also described something of the recipe, and he apparently replicated the recipe too. And he described, for instance, the formation of a ring of gold between the rosemary oil and the aqua regia. We observed the same. So we are pretty sure that we are replicating the recipe, even if we don't observe the same color that the recipe itself describes, you know. So
there is a question precisely to this point. I think Ernst has the question. Can you ask it loud, perhaps? Ernst Homburg. Sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering, because you didn't see the phenomena which was described in the experimental description. You worked in the same temperature region, or it's just a condition by boiling points, etc. So, I mean, there are so many details in furnaces which can differ, and with temperatures that maybe other phenomena pop up.
Joaquin,
Joaquin, you are muted.
yeah. No. I didn't use any furnace. This is done at room temperature. No need of any furnace. No. I mean, you know, no. You just put the solution in a funnel, and then on top of it the rosemary oil, and that's all. You don't need to heat anything.
But sometimes there is interaction with the walls of the equipment.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah, right. That's why we are. I was trying to compare the description of the properties of the product at the time with what I observed, in order to check whether I was observing the same properties, I would say, that they were describing. This is the point, you know. So I observed the same things, save the color of the rosemary oil, but I insist on that. The color should change because there is always a chemical reaction between the aqua regia, which is extremely strong acid and oxidant, and the rosemary oil. So this is something that can be expected. Okay, and also I mentioned before that one of the commentators of the recipe, in fact, the first commentator of the recipe said that an oily substance is formed due to the reaction between the rosemary oil and the aqua regia, but he didn't mention any change of the color. That's right, just the formation of an oily substance.
So going back to the original question being asked about the peer review, if you're peer reviewing old science, I was going to ask the same question of Sven and Thijs and Donna, if they want to contribute to an answer to this. What are your views about this, Sven?
Yeah, I never have the impression that I'm peer reviewing old science. So I do not think that we're replicating in that sense. I think I'm never trying to figure out in what ways it might be right or wrong. I mean, we might be getting at differences between the text and the actual practices. And that's, I think, something that we can do. And we can raise new historical questions by reconstructing. But I do not think that we sort of figure it out in terms of peer reviewing, in terms of replicating, and then figure it out whether it's right or wrong, in the sense that a natural scientist would actually do. So I would very much refrain and stand back from that idea that I'm peer reviewing.
Donna, what do you think?
I'm really interested in what does our thinking look like when we're not trying to be conclusive or come up with an answer? I mean, both modalities are important. Sometimes, you embark on a project in order to offer a resolution or particular findings. But when you embark on research where the questions open up, this is something we've all been touching on in our own ways. The questions prompt further investigations. It's like an ability to, it's a tool for opening up the investigation in a way that's otherwise not available. what I think is a really important tool, and something that Joe and Joaquin and I actually were talking about last week, I'm much more interested in using my imagination as a way to develop my intuition when I'm working with materials and matter. And in the work that I've done in early modern emblem analysis, I've come to appreciate ways in which allegorical language, decknomen, all of these devices, quote unquote, are actually tools used to sharpen the intellect and discipline and tutor the mind in service of these types of experimental investigations. And for me, it's not a matter of peer reviewing, but rather it's a matter of legitimizing imagination as part of the historian's methodology and toolkit. That's what I think.
Thijs, what is your point of view?
The funny thing is that I've done a couple of reconstructions, reenactments, whatever you want to call them, and what I liked about it is that is the feeling that I was learning new things, but this means that I was the one learning. And I mean, if you learn, you cannot be the peer reviewing historical actors at the same time. So instead of testing them and seeing if they were right in some way or another, I was these experiences really taught me a lot about, well, the way they looked at the world, the way they sensed the world. I mean, and these things were quite new. It can be quite new from a modern perspective. But then again, I also agree very much with Donna, and I see the performance of these reconstructions or reenactments very much as a way to open up more questions that you could not possibly have thought of before you ever encountered or endeavored experiments like this. So one of the things that we learned doing the reconstructions of the Rosicchiaro glass, the red transparent glass, is that furnaces can make a tremendous impact or have a tremendous impact on the quality of the glass. You have furnaces, well, if you use modern day equipment, you have electric furnaces, which means that there is no combustion taking place. There is no smoke, in other words. And smoke is also chemically active, can be chemically active. So as soon as you start using wood-fired furnaces, I mean, there's a completely different environment that you need to take into account. And what we saw reproducing these Rosicchiaro glasses is that this really happened. The glass itself, it was in the worst possible condition that you could find it in. There were actually reduced metallic parts in it. And as of now, the glass was really degrading. But this to us really showed the importance of taking these effects into account. And in that way, I mean, doing these experiments, going through these experiences, showed us that the next time that we start working on glass recipes, we really need to take a look at the furnace first and understanding this equipment rather than putting the right ingredients together, something like that. Yeah.
I want to jump in. Sorry,
I'm sorry, Donna, please.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in on the point of the furnace, because this is something that actually Thijs and I were talking about earlier today. So in the goldsmith studio where I work at, or rather where I rent a bench, it's in Midtown Manhattan, not far from where I'm based, not far from where I live. I want to point to just how flexible actually the furnace is. It's not necessarily like a designated piece of equipment, like a kind of furniture. It's something that you can assemble on the fly. There was, for example, I was doing granulation with my with the woman that I work with at the goldsmith studio, and we needed a particular type of heat. So we took bricks that were, that goldsmiths use, and some large ceramic tiles. And Jeanette didn't call it a reverberatory furnace, but I realized when she was assembling it, oh, we're making a reverberatory furnace. We took literally 6 blocks, piled them together, tilted the ceramic tiles so that the flame would bounce back in order to target as much heat, direct as much heat as possible onto the gold that we were working. So it's something that we pulled together in a matter of minutes and then dismantled when we were finished. So there's like a kind of fluidity and flexibility that's a part of this process that I think is maybe not so legible in the texts, and we can make assumptions that we may not even realize we hold until we engage in reconstruction or recreation, whatever you want to call it, about just how repurposable things are in order to make the kind of equipment that you need in the moment to address the needs of the process or whatever it is you're hoping to make in the end. So that for me is also another really important takeaway from this act of engaging with materials. It's not just about opening up new kinds of questions to ask that you wouldn't think of before, although that's huge. It's a way for us to be able to confront the assumptions that we hold that we don't even know are there, that act as barriers to textual interpretation or analysis writ large. So I wanted to pop that in there as well.
Thank you. And actually, this is a very important subject, and we have to come back to the question of artisanal knowledge and material practices and tacit knowledge. But we have some questions from students. So I wanted to introduce a student question by Sean Cohen. Sean, if you want to intervene right now.
Yeah, thanks. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so right now I'm actually a postdoc at Humboldt in Berlin, and I'm about to start a new project on the history of Greco-Roman perfumery at the Czech Academy of Sciences. So it's a 5-year project, and I used to work in a lab when I was younger, but I'll be starting now again. And I've never worked in organic chemistry. And so I'm wondering for everyone, if there's any experiences that you had in the lab that you wish you had known you would have had before you started, if there's anything obvious that you wish you would have known, if you share those experiences.
So how does one become an experimental historian?
Just by jumping in and trying. That's it. That's the secret sauce. The preparedness to go freestyle and step outside of the historiographic canon and just try something.
And allow yourself to make mistakes.
Start small. Don't do too much at once. Like limit your experiment. That's one thing that I found that I think for myself in my experiments, we drew the boundaries a bit too wide, trying to do too much. So doing small steps, I think, is really useful, and sort of do things that you can verify and so on, and just start again. Then, yeah.
But actually, do you need the facility for doing it? I mean, can you start in the kitchen? Can you start in the backyard? And what can you start with?
Anything and everything. The kitchen is a good place to start. It's a natural place to start. And it's also, I think, one of the most psychologically forgiving places to start, because we've all tried to make that dish that goes right into the composter, right? And then we move on from there. But one of the most transferable elements actually from the Making and Knowing project in terms of the pedagogy around reconstruction is early modern culinary reconstruction. And you can go on to like EBO, early modern, what is the acronym for EBO? EBO, or, archive.org, and just pull up an early modern cookbook and select a recipe. And that will give you direct engagement with tacit knowledge. That will give you direct engagement with, oh my God, variables. What am I going to do about this? Clearly, the 17th century egg is very different from our 21st century egg, but it gives you the opportunity just to be playful. And I think that's really the most important point. Just be playful. And what happens in the kitchen can stay in the kitchen.
Would depend a bit though on which materials you're using. If you're using any poisonous, toxic materials, don't use your kitchen.
Yeah, use common sense. That might be a good general advice.
Right. Most early modern culinary recipes don't require mercury.
Seb Falk from Cambridge had a question much earlier. We're trying to get to all the questions, but there is a deluge coming here. So Seb, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, thank you. This is this is really fascinating to me. I'm a historian of astronomy, and I've tried to recreate astronomical instrument texts, instruction manuals for making astronomical instruments. So I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, because really my aim was to learn about the effectiveness of the texts as teaching texts, rather than how I kind of assumed from the outset that the eventual product would work. I didn't have a kind of sense of, is this going to be effective or not? So I did have a question, but I think that's kind of been answered now, about the sort of experimenter's regress and how you can tell the difference between, if something doesn't work, whether it's your own problem, your own fault for not doing it correctly, or whether it's something in the text or something in the understanding of the historical actor that was lacking. But I have a question instead about what you do with the product that you've made and what the value is of that. I'm working at the moment on replica clocks, and some of these clocks were made precisely to figure out the gaps in texts describing historical clocks. So you've got a text describing or illustrating some gearing, but it doesn't seem to quite work. And so these clocks have been reconstructed, usually by a historian in collaboration with a professional clockmaker, and then put on display in a museum, because what else are you going to do with it? And I wondered what you thought about that, and about the kind of value in sort of public facing way of putting these things on display.
Well, perhaps, yeah, Marika.
Well, again, it depends on what you were trying to achieve, I guess. And in the case of clocks, I can imagine that a museum would actually be the best place for them. However, for example, in the case of that little oven that we recreated, there's not much of a point putting it in a museum, because then it would just be this dead object in a display case. I think it's much more useful to actually drag that to conferences, if we're ever allowed to go there again, and firing it up and using it to communicate our findings. So yeah, it really depends on what you're reconstructing or reworking, I guess. Is it about a process, or is it about exactly, figuring out how a text functioned, or is it about the object that you want to show to a broader audience, and that speaks for more or less for itself when it's on display?
My comment actually dovetails with Marike's, and this is where we can extend our research and our findings and the artifacts that we produce to other educational contexts. Why not create a teaching collection that's not just aimed at university level or communities of scholars, but K to 12, reaching out, fostering collaborations and connections with teachers in elementary schools, and finding ways to connect what we do in early modern science to science curricula from K to 12. This could be really effective, really important public facing work that also sparks curiosity of young children, young people, in really important ways in terms of their own intellectual development. But that's something that I would recommend.
No, I think there it would be really interesting to see all the failed things, you know, the clock that doesn't work or doesn't even look like a clock or is a bit of brown sludge, you know, because this is so much of the process, really. I mean, it really depends on what are you using as your source. Are you really recreating something with a clear outcome? And the clock is a nice example. For me, my first experiments were about elixirs of immortality. So there was never going to be any way we could test the outcome. But I think I always document things where there's doubt, where something doesn't look right, when something clearly went wrong, and so on. I think these are interesting in themselves. So I think as a pedagogical experiment, I would want to see an exhibition of things that went wrong, you know, as a very valuable contribution to how knowledge is gathered, and you know, also to how a text is used. You know, if it's about, you know, could this be used as a manual? You know, was it useful if you can follow it? So, you know, there you could really show where things would go wrong or would have to go wrong or could go wrong and so on. I think this would be like in a museum. I would like to see both the successful outcomes and the unsuccessful ones put side by side to tell a bit more of an interesting story.
The discussion went into a very interesting direction, and we also have a question about this on YouTube from Juana again about this kind of doing experimental history as a way of teaching and how much you engage and what a wonderful way of teaching this is and how it perhaps stimulates creativity. So from what you have said already, we have seen that that's a very interesting way of approaching the notion of error, stimulating surprise when it comes to teaching. But there is also something else that some of you are doing, which is placing your work in different cultural contexts or trying to translate from very, very different cultural contexts. So maybe you want to reflect on that a bit. How does it serve teaching? How does it serve, I don't know, the heuristic of discovery, this translating from a very different cultural context? Dagmar, for example, you are talking about Sanskrit.
Yeah, I was just thinking, okay, so Sanskrit is one issue, and then it's 1,000 years ago, and then it's on a different continent, you know, with the recreations or reconstructions happening in the UK, which is very different weather from India, and you know, to get hands on the necessary plant materials and minerals and so on. All of that means that these reconstructions are often more like approximations, and really what they do is just change the way we look at the text or understand the text, and they create different kinds of questions. But when I use this, so I also teach courses on history of alchemy, of South Asian alchemy, and there this sort of practical aspect. So because I'm teaching in a context where my students don't really know about South Asian history, culture, really anything, bringing in the materials is something that somehow gives them a much more direct access to the world of thought that is represented, you know, through, in this case, the aspect of Indian culture that is alchemy. And I find it's just a much more direct way even through the aesthetics, really, of inspiring students to think more about the culture, to really develop an interest. So it's just even as a didactic, you know, device. And there I found really, yeah, something we haven't really talked about, but it's the aesthetics of what is happening, the beauty of the materials. You know, mercury is beautiful, and I can't show it in class because it's a toxic material and we're in a history lecture room, right? So I'll bring mica and let them grind mica, and then they can experience for themselves how hard it is to, you know, grind mica. But a lot of the things, you know, the beautiful colors, the smells, the not so beautiful smells, but, you know, the things that they can sort of experience at once is something that is meaningful to the students, and is kind of like a gateway into thinking then a bit more systematically about, you know, the textual traditions and the history overall and so on. So
Sven, I was wondering what you feel about this this cross-cultural aspect of and not just cross-cultural, but let's say this bridging across the artisanal world, the alchemists. I mean, what you found through what this kind of experimental history can tell us about the varied people that have been working in it.
I think we also use it in teaching in a way to actually bridge and bring those worlds. So I very much subscribe to what Dagmar has just said. I think it's a matter of bringing students of today, giving them some sense of material literacy that has basically gone lost and that they no longer have. And just having them play around with these materials and actually bringing them into contact with these materials using, all their senses is actually a way of allowing them sort of access to these, processes, artisanal processes, also in the past, and so. We use it, for example, and Thijs can tell much more about this. We use it, for example, in sort of first year classes with art history students who we just bring into the lab and for the first time sort of have them experience, very basic processes of art making. They do their own glass blowing, their own etching, etc. And just by doing that once and having them, feel what it actually is, how a glass behaves, how fast, for example, cools down once you actually, remove it from the furnace, and that it becomes very difficult to work. That is much more sort of engaging and telling for them than actually, reading this over and over again from text. And so I think it's that basic sense in sort of that sort of bridging that particular experience can actually, achieve. But Thijs might have much more sort of first-hand experience.
It's a great course that we teach in art history, but there's another course which comes to mind, which is, it basically revolves around making reconstructions of 16th century old recipes. And the thing about it is that there is much to be gained from co-creation. Teaching students does not mean that knowledge should flow from one direction into the other. We can also work together with students, and students can also be involved much. Well, reconstructions are a very interesting way to involve students into research. Well, one of the things I can mention an example of a recipe. There's a recipe that we have been using for a couple of years now, and what's so fun about this recipe is that I haven't found a chemist yet who could make sense of it, but it works. It's a recipe for silver plating copper, and this is can be a very basic chemical reaction, but as long as you start with ingredients in such way that you have silver in a dissolved state. If you put silver in a dissolved state into contact with copper, it will plate the copper immediately. But this recipe has plain silver and nothing to dissolve the silver, and yet it works. And we've been working with a couple of chemists. We have students from chemistry, and all these students, they rack their brains about it. They write very interesting papers, and meanwhile we're still stuck. But the thing is that it opens up a lot of interesting questions for us teachers during this course. But the students, they feel that they actually are able to contribute to ongoing research, and in that way, it's a very good way, I think, to make them enthusiastic and to feel them, to let them feel that they are really involved, and that the things that they are learning are really state of the art. Yeah, that's the thing that I wanted to add to what Sven just mentioned already.
Yeah, thank you for this. And actually, let's stay just 1 minute more at teaching, because sometimes I was wondering whether teaching itself is not a sort of recreating experiments. And I would like Donna to tell us the story that we discussed she told us at the previous discussion about moving her experiment in very, very different cultural contexts to very different groups of students. And what did you learn by doing this, Donna?
Oh boy. Well, first thing I learned is trees don't grow in the Arctic.
Well, you actually have to tell us a bit about
Yeah.
About the mystery of your experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, Donna's referring to the article actually that I wrote as part of my contribution to Marike's special issue. So this is the imitation coral. This is the imitation coral experiment. And as I noted earlier in our discussion today, it played out in 3 very different educational contexts. First at Columbia as part of the Making and Knowing project, then at Nunavut Arctic College, where I led a workshop reconstructing imitation coral with Inuit middle art students, and then finally with Dominic Hooniger and his group at Universität Hamburg. But in the Arctic coral making context, I was just really curious. Having reconstructed the imitation coral at Columbia was fresh in my mind, and a former classmate of mine from jewelry school is the program director at Nunavut Arctic College, and she invited me up to lead a workshop to her jewelry arts, metal arts students, because she wanted me as a historian to open up her students to greater creativity with their own jewelry making by exposing them to genres and techniques from other cultures. So I thought imitation coral making would be really interesting because it's doable with a small group. It only requires, vermilion pigment, walnut oil, thorny branches, and resin. So the one thing I didn't bring up north with me, because I knew that it wouldn't clear customs, I was flying in from New York, were the thorny branches. I was tired. I don't know what I was thinking, because of course there aren't any trees in the Arctic, as I was reminded of looking down at the tundra flying into Nunavut. But this mistake of mine, this error, enabled the students actually to lay cultural claim to a 16th century French recipe in a way that I couldn't have anticipated or scripted in a lesson plan, because the solution was to use caribou antler that Beata, my friend, the instructor at Nunavut, had on hand in the studio. So it was a really interesting experience for me for various reasons. First of all, I assumed that the students knew what coral was. It didn't even occur to me that, there isn't universal knowledge about this polyp. So when I began the morning session, just, giving historical context about early modern artifacts that use coral in preparation for the reconstruction in the studio in the afternoon, one of the students raised his hand, part of the way through the discussion, and said, "Well, what is coral?" So, oh my God, why? I was mortified. But then, I just abandoned my lesson plan and started pulling up YouTube videos, interactive maps on the desktops that were in the classroom. And we started charting an adventure through an adventure of biodiversity. And this prompted the students then to start sharing their relationship with, most of them are hunters. They understand their land stewardship as harvesting the land when they fish, or when they go sealing, or when they're hunting on the land. So they started sharing their relationship with nature as I started then being able to better contextualize what past other cultural relationships with nature, naturalia and artificialia, were. And basically my assumption about universal knowledge of coral, and then my error in not bringing up the fantastical thorny branches that the recipe called for, enabled the students to be able to play with the recipe according to their own cultural artistic traditions. And this recipe then, this 16th century recipe, became the key that opened us up to one another's worlds as we were both able to explore what we do, how we think, and what this produces. It was, as Thijs was discussing earlier, it's a co-creation of knowledge. It stopped with that "what is coral" question. the session stopped being a one-way flow of transmission and became a community around the question, what is choral, and all of the ways that it opened us up to one another's worlds. So that for me was a really powerful, humbling, transformative, and expansive experience. And I don't know what else to say. That there's so
to me,
much
I like very much your example. I like very much your example because it teaches us something very interesting about the nature of teaching, which seems to be a kind of reenactment, no matter what kind of things you're teaching.
It's also humanizing reenactment. It's not just about producing knowledge. It's about learning how to know. And both coexist and both are very important, but I think we tend to focus on what the result is, even though we're getting there from this place of open questions. But really what's going on, I feel, is we learn how to know through acquiring knowledge with this material engagement. And that, I think, is really important to foreground in the kinds of articles we write and the kinds of pedagogy maybe we strive to design.
Actually, it is interesting because my question was looks like it's gonna segue from yours, because I was actually thinking about the fact that this RRR network, this framework, reconstructing, recreating, is about embodiment and about living the experience, about the process of doing things. Of course, you want to get to the goal, whether you can or not. But something that fascinates me is who this process and this experience is for. And can you, I mean, of course, you as a researcher experience and you capture these things. But how can you convey them to a larger audience? Can it be, for instance, of course it can be taught in the classroom. Are there other ways that we can capture this experience, this embodied experience of doing something, of making something? And how can we reflect it in a way in a scholarly output, or should we reflect it in a scholarly output? What do you think?
If I can jump in on this, this for me relates directly to the Golden Mercury project that I'm leading, and actually Matteo Martelli is part of it, but he's jumped off of the Zoom screen, so I can't like draw him in. But the Golden Mercury project is. It involves scholars from medical anthropology, philology, environmental history, STS and archaeology, material culture. And as I noted earlier, we're all examining ways in which gold and mercury have worked their ways through cultures, environments, and bodies from this transcultural, transhistorical examination. But this project actually stems from my questions as a maker. As a goldsmith, I want to use mercury-free gold. It's not available. It's impossible to get your hands on. And probing why immediately reveals a Gordian knot of controversy around an environmental and humanitarian crisis that a substantial portion of the contamination of our biosphere comes from gold and mercury amalgamation mining that's happening 1 million times over a day all around the globe by artisanal and small scale gold miners who, this is subsistence livelihood. For me, the big question is, why is mercury so readily available? But in an effort to provide for themselves, they're engaging in a process that is toxic to their bodies and also to the environment. So the Golden Mercury project really stems from my questions as a maker. It's not part of a historiographical debate. It's an intellectual question and examination, but it comes from a maker's set of questions. So I think that directly addresses, Joe, your question. And also in terms of the Golden Mercury project, this is my way of being able to really explore alchemy in a current day, contemporary and environmental context, because I understand the earth as an alembic. And in the Golden Mercury amalgamation process, what happens is mercury is a liquid metal. Upon encountering gold, it immediately looks like it's devouring it. So if you're panning for gold and you have your ore and dirt, you pour your mercury into the receptacle, it immediately sucks it up. And you're left with a golden ball, an alloy, a paste. And frankly, this is part of the fire gilding process. Think of Versailles as like a monument, a colossus of mercury gold amalgamation. Anyway, you heat the mercury, it vaporizes, and the gold is left behind. And then the ASM miner takes that to market. And that process is immediately upon heating that amalgam, several things are set into motion at once. The miner, who could be a child, a pregnant woman, an older man, is immediately poisoned. The vapor is released into the air, but because it's a heavy metal, it will condense. And one of two things will happen. It either settles, enters into the groundwater, is absorbed by fish, becomes methylmercury, and is the reason why all of our fish and shellfish on the planet are contaminated with mercury to varying degrees. Or it rises, gets caught up in the atmosphere, and is distributed planet-wide by rain and snow. So in thinking metaphorically in these alchemical terms of the earth as an alembic, it's an inversion of the early modern understanding of the alembic as a vessel of purification, where mercury is purified, and according to the early modern theories, this is the ways in which it then penetrates in its beneficial way and does its work within the bodies. In this context, it's the opposite. It insinuates and contaminates and pollutes everything that it comes in contact with. And for me, the question becomes, how do we step out of this cycle? But I'm starting to see alchemy in terms of environmental alchemy. And that's really where reconstruction has been leading me. And this has not been planned. This is, again, just following these open questions. And this is the current result in the continuum of my life. But I
would actually like to introduce Dagmar here, because we have been discussing at our previous discussion, Dagmar, about how much mercury is in Indian medicine. So that ties up very, very nicely with Donna's environmental questions. How do you see this?
You know, just thinking about what Donna was saying about the environmental concerns about mercury, probably then we should not be recreating mercury-based experiments, because yes, you know, there's vapors and so on created. Usually people think of it in terms of the health worries for the people doing the making the products and so on, and that's certainly a concern. But just thinking about should we, to what extent can we or should we capture the process of recreation? So one of the things that we found is, so Andrew is doing the experiments and he's also filming them as he goes along and takes photographs. And so what he's been saying is that, of course, you know, the actual capturing of the experiment, which I want to do because I want to share what we're doing and how we're understanding things, you know, but it's also very disruptive to what he's doing. It's not so easy, you know, if he's working with melted copper, let's say, you know, and it's 800 degrees and he has to pour, and at the same time he has to watch that the camera is at the right angle, and is it actually, you know, did he click, you know, the on switch and so on. So this sort of moment where he has to stop and start really changes, of course, the experience of doing the activity. So even by capturing, by documenting what you're doing, you're actually changing the thing itself at that very moment, right? So I don't know how one could stop this, except for maybe just a third person being there to do it instead of, you know, poor Andrew having to do absolutely everything at that moment. But this is something to take into account. So I feel, yes, I definitely want to capture this. One thing that is a little bit of a worry to me, so we've been doing these recreations and we've put them online with accompanying blogs explaining what we're doing and so on, and the queries we get sent is basic queries of people who also want to do it for, I think, actually making the elixirs or making the coral or making, you know, so it's a little bit worrying to me to think that in our documentation people see it as a how-to manual. And so you know, we always just write a do not do this at home. You know, the person doing this is trained specifically in the procedures and so on and has particular knowledge that makes it as safe as possible for him to do these procedures. But of course, you know, you have no power over what people will do when something is out there in the public. And it's of course very different when you have just a paper, you know, that is published in a historical journal where somebody will be reading and going, oh, this is interesting. And that's pretty much the extent of, you know, what's going to happen there. So, you know, I think for, you know, people who are making, you know, who are looking at artisanal knowledge and so on, which will concern, you know, a different part of the public, you know, I think the documentation is something where you have to think about the ethics of the information you're conveying. And I think we've been a little bit naive in doing so in our Mercury experiments.
Thank you. So historical experimentation poses all sorts of questions, as we have seen so far. Questions relating to the cultural clashes or different kinds of cultures, questions relating to teaching, questions related to ethics and morals. I would like to, we are approaching the end of our discussion. So I would like to go into the direction of what are the new questions, new historical questions, philosophical questions, and maybe even more than that, new scientific questions that your work is addressing. At some point, Sven said something about the fact that he's interested in the new historical questions, but he might also say something about the new scientific questions he's encountering in recreating experiments. Sven Dupré.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that in addition to the value that the historical recreation has for a better understanding of the past, and I would like to highlight that maybe it is worth to explore the knowledge, the chemical knowledge of the past, in order to look for something that can be useful for the present, for modern science, you know. So I think that there are so huge amount of exchange or unusual chemical procedures described in our books that nobody has ever reproduced with a modern mind, you know, and nobody has able to reproduce and look at them by using modern scientific tools, I would say, you know. I think that it will be nice to explore in a more systematic way this recipe. Of course, there are recipes which are trivial, I would say, you know. It's not a matter to recreate the making of copper sulfate, you know. But there are so many rare, strange, unusual procedures used in the past that I am sure that some of them, I don't know how many, but some of them will give something interesting. In the same way that I have done with this 18th century recipe for potable gold, which contains gold cluster. This is extremely unusual. It's a very simple and way to make such kind of particles, no? And I know books or procedures that do the same with silver, iron, antimony, lead, tin, and so on, copper, iron, you know. So I think that maybe the cooperation between historian and chemist in this field will be extremely productive. I think this is something to think about.
Thank you. Sven, new historical questions.
Yeah, no, new historical questions. I think the most interesting ones are probably the ones that are, that you do not expect. So in a sense, would be unwise, even counterproductive to sort of pose new historical questions. I do think there's sort of new scientific questions. And I think it's very much related to what Donna has been saying. I think there's lots of sort of interest in sort of tapping into lost knowledge, which might in fact be very interesting and key to, current environmental concerns. We've worked with, for example, with an artist, Claudia Youngstra, was very, very interested in actually bringing back all sorts of processes of dyeing, of color dyeing textiles, based on local plants, local materials, of which there was knowledge of how to grow them until quite recently, which have been replaced by much more polluting processes, in many cases also by materials which often had to be flown in from far away rather than locally grown. And I think so there's lots of sort of material there that could be tapped to address these conservation concerns. And that would be, in a sense, just a continuation of long processes, I think, of reinvention, which you basically see through history, and which are quite typical, I think, for the sort of artisanal processes, artisanal knowledge that we're looking at, which are, historically, constantly processes of getting lost and being reinvented. And that's where lots of the innovation of today responds to, I think, environmental concerns is actually in a sort of reinvention of processes which have gone lost. So I do think that there is a lot of new scientific potential in that.
I just have the feeling that since we have Ha-Seok Chang with us tonight, that's the moment to introduce Ha-Seok to talk about the new scientific knowledge in the replications. Ha-Seok.
Hello, it's been fascinating to listen to all of your wonderful talks and ideas. No, I would say, for me, personally, right, in my research, the most important thing about replications is the recovery of knowledge from the past science that modern science has become blind to. And as a historian, for me, that's the point there is respect for the past, right? That there was this knowledge that we've lost sight of. And going back to the text is a way of engaging with that respect, of course. But I think going back to the lab with the reproduction of the experiments, the re-experiencing of what they were doing, I think that really brings a whole extra dimension to how we engage with the past with respect and learn from their knowledge in a way that can be relevant even to modern science, like Joaquin and others have been doing. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ha-Seok. We are unfortunately quite out of time at the moment. I would like to ask each of our speakers if they can provide a very, very brief conclusion of our discussion. It seems to me that basically we need more sessions of this because there are so many things that have come out of it. Sven, would you like to say a few words?
Okay, very brief then. I think the two keywords perhaps are play and imagination. So I often talk about what we create, whether it's in the lab or whether it's outside the lab, in terms of material playgrounds. And some people hate me for it, but I do think that that's what it actually is. I think they are material playgrounds. And so I think that notion of play also in sort of creating past presence, which is sort of bridging the past and the present, we're always hybrid in a sense, is absolutely key. And imagination, I think, has been, mentioned several times, I think, as a key concept. I think it also points us to the question that came up in several, on several occasions is how do you do this if you do not have access to a lab, because all of this is great fun in a way, but it's also incredibly time and energy consuming, and it costs often money, and accessibility to some of these facilities is not always easy. But even if you don't do that, you can use the kitchen, as we've learned, but you can also just use your imagination. And we've, I mean, also with Thijs, we've been quite happy in actually creating sort of what we call imaginative ethnographies, where we basically set people and students in a room with a recipe and have them imagine what it would like, and that alone also brings up sort of quite interesting questions, even before you actually have access to any sort of material whatsoever. And so I think imagination is another key.
Well, actually, I think that this is very useful, Sven. Thank you. If the pandemic continues, then we have to discuss about finding material playgrounds at some point in the future. So you are our guest for a future discussion with this title. Right, so conclusions, perhaps Marieke?
Yes, thank you. Well, following up on what Sven just said, I just ran a course this past year for grad students in which we combined introductions to paleography, transcription, and reconstructions, and we used culinary recipes for that because it's a very easy way to introduce people to this. And it was a great success, actually, and I hadn't expected it because we had to do it online, but it was a way to engage the senses in historical research, especially in times of Zoom. So I think that that is something to keep in mind, that we can also use this this methodology, however broad and sometimes undefined it might seem, to really engage new generations in our historical research, and that it really is a great way to engage with the past and do basically what the ends of history are, to uncover historical facts and to communicate those in engaging ways. Thank you.
Dagmar, some concluding thoughts?
So my own thoughts are very unformed on this, because, you know, I'm working in a quite isolated way as a South Asianist. So it's, you know, my first aim is to basically make people aware that there is such a thing as South Asian alchemy to begin with. But if I'm thinking sort of more broadly, you know, we've heard about, you know, respect for the past and so on. So one thing in my own experimentation and work is that I do want to get away from ideas of proof and correctness and judging, you know, medieval Indian alchemy as science as such, but rather it's more of an experiment with, well, inquisitiveness on one hand, but an experiment in empathy, as it were, you know. So you're recreating something, and in such a maybe coming a little bit closer to what happened in the past with those particular peoples in the past in their specific cultural context. So, you know, it's always just an approximation maybe, but this is the general direction that I want to go to. So to create this sort of greater closeness or empathy with cultures and thoughts and ideas that are otherwise foreign and far away from us with my kind of experimentation. So this is sort of the general direction that I want to go to with my experiments.
Thijs, would you like to say a few words next?
Well, I've already heard so many interesting and great concluding remarks, Joe, that I think it's only appropriate for me to just thank you very much for organizing this and putting all this together, and everyone for participating in a very great discussion, which was really insightful. So thank you.
Donna?
First, I want to say ditto to everything that everyone has said. But I kind of want to leave on this cliffhanger. We talk a lot about interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I encourage us to think multi-professional, cross-professional. And if humanities trained scholars are like the Swiss Army knife of methodologies for interpretation, contextualization, analysis, we should be dialoguing with business. And we should be bringing our knowledge of past technologies to bear on talking through questions about sustainability, greening, ways in which people in the past also addressed problems from their periods through the technologies that they innovated to deal with, in ways that we can bring that knowledge to bear on helping resolve and address the things that are currently characterizing our period. And I really encourage us not just to think about ourselves as historians, but to be in engaging in this way with real-time present-day issues. We can be the group that society turns to think about a sustainable future. And I think we are particularly well suited because of the ways in which we think and practice to be important players in this discussion.
And finally, Joaquin.
Well, really, I have nothing extra to add, or maybe just to highlight the value of the recreation of ancient process as an human experience, because your senses are engaged there in the experience in a way that it is sometimes very difficult to translate, to communicate. No? Also, it's a way to connect with the past, with past abilities. And in my opinion, the recreation is not only an intellectual activity, I would say. It is also a sensual activity. You know? So nowadays we are inclined to value so much the intellect, but when you recreate something of the past, your senses are I mean, you have to pay attention to everything. You know, with all your sense, besides your intellect. This is something else. It's not so easy to communicate your experience, but it is not just an intellectual experience. This is my personal experience, I would say.
Well, we are way past the time, but time flies when you're having fun. So it was great to have you all here. I mean, thank you, each and every one of you, for coming. It was exciting for me to hear more about what's happening in this exciting new field, and encourage you all to participate in it. It is a great way to experience research rather than just let's say. And of course, thought is also an important part, as Sven was pointing out. Thought experiments are also useful, especially in our context. But let's hope that there will be future discussions on this subject, and there will be more interactions between us, because it's a hot topic, and it brings us much more knowledge about the past and about ourselves in a way. So thank you, everyone, and
thank
we'll
you
see you
all.
next time.
I think that as an experiment of imagination, tonight worked very well. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.